So family, it's interesting, I don't think I mentioned this necessarily. Last time I spoke, a message titled The Love of God, I knew when I spoke that there were other parts that were going to be coming out yet. I don't think that I ever envisioned it as a trilogy, but it's kind of looking like that's where it's headed. I'm supposed to speak again in a few weeks, and it's rare that I announce the title to messages far in advance, but this one got laid on me pretty heavy. So give you some food for thought and chew on. The title of that message is going to be, Where Did All the Pharisees Go? This one is family, and as we get into this, I want you to keep in mind the message on the love of God, loving God. This fits squarely in the middle. When I started that message, it was actually this one that I had in mind, but I couldn't preach this one without getting into what it meant to love God first. Because we can't talk about our relationships with people without having the relationship with God first. So with that, let's dive in here. First off, I wanted to just make sure we've got foundation laid here. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 through 22, here's what it says. So then, you are no longer foreigners and members, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. The whole building, being put together by him, grows into a holy sanctuary in the Lord. You also are being built together for God's dwelling in the Spirit. Now, we have to do a little bit of background inspection. I really loved the chance to get to preach all of 1 John. I'm not really that fond of grabbing verses here and there. I like to put it in its whole context. Unfortunately, fast food and fast everything has shortened our attention spans to the point where 3-hour sermons are frowned on now. You probably were thinking, well, 1 hour and 10-minute sermons should be frowned on, because I think that's about what you got subjected to last time. But Ephesians, what he's talking about here is previous to this. Remember, this is written to pagans, former pagans, okay? The saints in Ephesus. These people were not Christian, or in the context of the day, they were not Jewish, okay? So, up till this point, what he's been telling them is, do you understand what happened when Jesus Christ was crucified? How this barrier was torn down, you are in. And he ends it all up with, so then. This is kind of the summary of everything he's said in Ephesians up till now, talking specifically to you as those who were once far off. He's saying, so if you accept Jesus Christ, if you join this family, you are now a part of the family of God. He talks about it as a great mystery that has now been revealed. It was shocking to Judaism, by the way. Judaism was pretty well convinced that they had it, and you only got it if you jumped through a very narrow set of hoops that they, the rabbis and the Sanhedrin, got to decide. That's really where it was at before Jesus arrived on this earth. Yes, you could join the family of God, but men got to decide how you did it. That was their perception. And so you had men like Cornelius, who was a righteous man, it says, who had been busy jumping through the hoops that they'd given him because he had such a heart to serve God. He said, I so badly want to be a part of God's family that I will even jump through man's hoops if that's what it takes to get there. That's impressive. So Paul here is saying the door is wide open now. Do you want to be a part of this family? Now, I spent a pretty good chunk of the last week doing something I've never done before. I got sent out of town for work very abruptly. A week ago, Friday evening, it was like 4 in the afternoon. I'm getting ready to punch out in an hour or two, whatever it was. I'm going to go home, be home for the weekend, go back to work Monday, and I got a text message, hey, are you willing and ready to go to Detroit and babysit a pump for the weekend? I was like, oh, okay. So I got to get in touch with my wife, and mad scramble, yep, I'd do it. Then, as I was pulling out of the driveway from the shop to go home, they said, you can take your wife with you. We'll put you up in a hotel. It'll be a great time. You just got to go out and check this pump every 5 hours, make sure it keeps running, fix a couple things on the machine. Sounds like fun. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I got another call, and they said, we'd like you to stay on the crew, and we don't know when you're going to come back. So go ahead and take your wife, ship her home when the weekend's over, and you can come home when we're done. Okay, wow. That gave me, I was busy working on this message, or I should say God was busy working on this message in me. Right. But then I went and I spent a couple of great days with my wife. It really was pretty cool. I'm like, wow, is this what normal job is like? Like you get paid to stay in a nice hotel, and every 5 hours you go out and go, yep, it's still running, and you spend 2 hours on Saturday afternoon and 2 hours Sunday afternoon tinkering, and then you go to Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village and just kind of, wow. This is kind of cool. And then Sunday night, I took my weeping wife home because she was not ready to leave. Like, we haven't been separated for more than a night since we got married. So drove her halfway home, met my father-in-law. She came back, and then I spent Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and half of Thursday with a group of guys who works together on the road like this all the time. These guys, I am not kidding, spend more time together than they do with their families. They sometimes don't come home for 3 to 5 months at a time. The only times they see their families is when their families get flown out to see them for months. And I got to see a family unit, if you want to call it that, functioning. Some of these guys have literally known each other since high school. They're in their 30s now, and they've just kind of followed each other's business paths through life, and now you got one guy's the foreman, probably one of his best buds from high school is working with him. These guys know each other, know all about each other, eat together. We all slept in the same hotel. We all drove in the same truck. And so you take me and you plug me into the middle of this mix. One guy on the crew goes to church. I don't think he would make claims at being a Christian, but he goes to church. And the rest of them had varying degrees of explanations for why church was bogus. One guy said, when they found out that I was going to preach this Sunday, they were a little incredulous. They wanted to know what in the world the guy that was preaching Sunday was doing out there slogging around in the mud and the ice when it was 9 degrees in Detroit last week with them. And so after a couple days, one of the guys' question was, do you do weddings? And I says, well, kind of, once in a while. He says, do you charge? And I said, no. I said, if somebody wanted to give me some money, I might take it. But I said, no, I'm not big on charging. He said, do you know that preacher that married my wife and I hadn't even got the ceremony over, and he was over there with his hand out. He said, I didn't pay him, and I've never been back in church since. And I thought, ooh, that hurts. Ooh. And the next guy, we get talking. We had some great conversations over beer down at the local pub. And he says, the next guy, one day, I asked him something about if he'd been in church at all. And he said, oh, we hardly went when I was a kid. And then he tells me, he says, but I started dating this girl when I was in high school, and she was a Christian, and she went to church. And he said, I went to church with her a few times, and rapidly figured out she was a phony, her whole family was a phony. And I thought, oh, here comes the story, that they're all hypocrites. That was the end of church. But he said, I looked at all that, and he said, I thought, maybe there's something to this. He said, so I went to another church, and I joined a Bible study. And he said, I went for 2 years to that Bible study. And he said, at the end of 2 years, God wasn't there, so I called off the search. Guys, I wanted to cry. And I thought, and this is their family now. A bunch of guys on the road, out there making the big bucks, because they're making the big bucks. Doing crazy stuff that nobody else in the world is doing. And going to the bar at night and having a few drinks and going to the hotel, and then every few months you go home and deposit the big paychecks in the bank account, and that's family. So what does it mean to be a part of family? In Luke 14, 25 through 35, Jesus had a really interesting conversation with the crowds. I know that I've brought this up before, but I have to remind us of it because this is so unique and so contrary to every method of evangelism that we practice today. We spend all kinds of time trying to convince people that they should come to our church, trying to convince people that they should give their heart to Jesus, all these things that we try to convince people to do. But you realize Jesus did almost none of those? He didn't try to drag people home to his synagogue, as far as I can tell. He didn't try to convince them to accept him in the way that we think of we should. And the reason is because he is the same righteous Savior that also said, those who've been given much, of them much will be required. And he tried his best to never hand something to somebody that they weren't prepared to carry. So, in Luke 14, 25 through 35, here's what it says. Now, great crowds were traveling with him. He's getting extremely popular. I mean, you just got to picture this. If Jesus showed up here, it wouldn't take long, and it'd be hitting the headlines too. I mean, right now you hear of healings, and I've actually watched a couple of MSNBC, I think, did a segment on Our Healings Real. I watched, and they went around and tried to verify whether people were actually getting healed at these healing meetings and stuff, and it was so inconclusive, they ended up saying they thought it was all bogus. Like, they had a very hard time tracking people down that could definitively show medical evidence, I was sick before and I'm healed now. But when Jesus was walking this earth, if he showed up today, I guarantee you they'd have all the evidence they needed. And that was what was happening in his day. Crazy, amazing stuff. Thousands of people being fed at a time, the dead being raised. I mean, so many testimonies and stories that people could not write it off anymore. They had to stand up and pay attention. So these crowds are following him. A lot of these people presumably are following him because they've heard the stories and they want to see some of this stuff in action. They're thinking, even if they didn't have a problem, I mean, you think there's no television? A lot of things we do for entertainment aren't there. This was the most entertaining thing happening in the land of Israel. I mean, this is crazy, crazy stuff. So, huge crowds are following him. So he turned and said to them, he's going to preach to the crowd now. He's got this captive audience that's standing there, breathless, waiting to hear what he might say or do next. And he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to make fun of him, saying, this man started to build and wasn't able to finish. Or what king going to war against another king will not first sit down and decide if he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. In the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not say goodbye to all his possessions cannot be my disciple. Now salt is good, but if salt should lose its taste, how shall it be made salty? It isn't fit for the soil or for the manure pile. They throw it out. Anyone who has ears to hear should listen. So this is some deep, knotty, hard stuff. I got on the internet and did a little bit of searching just on what commentaries were on this, and they were all over the map. There were commentaries saying, now we have to be careful how we take this word hate and how we look at it, because he's not really saying hate your family. And I looked at all that and I thought, there's all kinds of explanations, but what did Jesus say here? The key to what Jesus said is down here at the bottom of this. When he says, in the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not say goodbye to all his possessions. What's funny about that is he hasn't been talking about possessions before this. He's been talking about relationships more. When he says that, I think it gets pretty clear. He's talking about an attitude that says, I so wish to walk with Jesus Christ, to be a part of his community, a part of his family, that I am willing, not willing in a sense that says, well, if God demands it of me, I'll pry my fingers off in it, but that we have already let go of everything. We aren't grasping it anymore. You understand, when God says hate your family, he's not talking about hate your family. He's talking hate in the way we understand hate. I should clarify that. He's talking about you love God so much and you trust him so much that even if your own family says, I hate God, and you are forced to part ways, that you trust God with them more than you even trust your own ability to reach them. Because God loves all of them more than you or I can. But now this line at the bottom, this is crazy. Last night, studying this, is the first time in my life I have ever understood what this thing about salt meant. I've read this, and I've read this, and I've read this, and I always thought, saltiness, it just didn't make sense. I've looked at the Greek words behind it. It just didn't make sense. I mean, stop and think about this once. Has anybody ever pulled a shaker of salt out of their cabinet, shook it, and gone, it lost its saltiness. It no longer tastes like salt. No, you know what you can do with salt? You can take it, dump it in a glass of water, dissolve it completely, dry it back out, and you can do that 1,000,000 times, and the product you get at the end will still taste like salt. You can disappear it so that it doesn't even look like salt, and it still is salt. Time after time, it always tastes like salt. Unless you get that nasty low-sodium fake stuff, then it starts sitting a little flaky, but that's a fake imitation, which should also tell us something. So when he says, now salt is good, he's talking about what's its purpose. You put it on food for one reason, because the food's bland without it. If it doesn't taste like salt, you wouldn't waste your time putting it on there. If somebody gave you white crystals that you dumped on your food that did nothing, you wouldn't keep putting it on there. Matter of fact, MSGs is put in our food, or has been. They try and get it out of there now because it gives you a desire to eat it. But you know that if somebody gave you a shaker of MSGs and you sprinkled it on your food, you would quit putting it on there because you wouldn't notice the effect. The person putting it on knows what it's going to do to you, but if they just gave it to you and said, put this on because it'll taste better, a couple of rounds you'd go, that didn't do anything for me. You wouldn't realize the effects. Salt's purpose is to lend a particular, I don't want to put it, it gives magnification to the flavor. So when he says, now salt's good, he's stating an obvious fact that we all know. Salt's good. We like it. Our doctors tell us we shouldn't as much. We like it. But if salt should by some freak chance cease to taste like salt, is there any possible way to make it salty again? Say, no, you'd throw it out. When he says this, what he's telling us, he's referring to everything he's just said. He's saying, if those that follow me don't do the things in the heart and attitude that those who follow me should, they're not following me. He used something so obvious like salt to say, you'd laugh at me for suggesting the idea that salt could taste like anything other than salt. And yet, he's telling them, you're all following me, but you're not following me. You look like salt, but you don't taste like salt. And he gives them a list of the things that they are not doing. So when we talk about family, part of the family of God, we should be looking at verses and chapters like this and saying, okay, do I taste like the salt that Jesus Christ says I should taste like? Now, there's nothing fun about some of this stuff. When I started coming to this church, I didn't come here because of anything other than that God sent me here. It's that simple. Like, I literally woke up. I'd been having a Bible study in my house on Sunday mornings. There'd been a group of guys about my age meeting there. I got woke up at like 2 in the morning. I'd been coming to the Bible study here on Monday nights, stand together, for about 2-3 months, something like that. I woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning with just this overwhelming urgency laid upon me that I had to come to this church that morning. This is like Saturday night, Sunday morning, 2 in the morning. I called up my buddy Nathan as early as I dared and said, hey, my house is still here, the food will still be here, the Bible will still be here. You guys come all let yourselves in, I won't be there. I've got a church I got to go to. Now, when that happened, one of the greatest influences in my life was my grandmother. She, I am sure, commenced to praying that God would deliver me from this powerful delusion that I was now under. And gave my friend Mike quite a speech just a few months after that about how I was out of my senses and how I had abandoned my faith and my family. And to this day, my grandmother, I will stand up and say, is one of the most powerful influences in my life. I lived with her for the last 7 years she was alive. And I loved and do love my grandmother probably more powerfully than almost any other person on this earth. And yet the day came, I'm not telling you my grandmother didn't go to heaven. I saw how she lived her life. I expect to meet my grandmother there, but I also expect her to have a little different view of some of the things that have to do with God's family than what she had while she was here. But I can't even begin to describe to you the excruciating pain that it caused me to have to choose between the direction that I was convinced God had called me to go and knowing that it was causing my grandmother pain and agony and to be in fear for my salvation that I was going that direction. I had to hate my family. I didn't cease to love my grandmother. I simply commenced to loving God more. Right. So now, moving on, Matthew 10:32 through 39 has this to say, "Therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before men, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven. Don't assume that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. The person who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The person who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Anyone finding his life will lose it, and anyone losing his life because of me will find it." Some more deep, weighty stuff. I've drugged some of these in here because we have to realize this was not some rare exception when Jesus said these kinds of things. These are interspersed to his whole ministry. We'll get into it more as we proceed here. There's much greater depth under this stuff than what we realize. But I want to highlight a second this very last line where he says, anyone finding his life will lose it. I think he's digging into here some of the motivations for why people were following him and for why perhaps we might want to follow him. See, a lot of us, myself included, when we first come to Jesus, we come to him, as Paul describes in one of the epistles, he says, we have even known Christ in the flesh, but no longer. I might be paraphrasing a bit, but that's how he says it. Many of us, when we first come to Jesus Christ, we show up just like the crowds did. We're curious what he can do for us. We are seeking to save our life. There is an earnest fear of hellfire. There is a desperation, and can I even say a depression that goes along with living a life for ourselves. And we say, I just want life back. And he says, anyone finding his life will lose it. So what I perceive Jesus to be saying here is, if that's where you stop, that's not what it's about. If you're here to get your life back, my life the way that I would like it to be, you've ultimately not got to the bottom of the message that Jesus has for us. He says, and anyone losing his life because of me will find it. Up here when he says, does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. At some point in this journey, we have to transition. We have to, or we are not salty anymore. We have to transition to the understanding that says, when I came to God, I came to him because I wanted to be a part of a big, warm, fuzzy, happy family. I wanted to be saved. I wanted to be secure in this life. You realize that? That most of us really, you can't see heaven, you can't see hell, you can't see eternity. What you can see is what's here. So most of us came to God to get now fixed. And he's saying here, you've got to look beyond that once. Once you've walked with God a little and tasted and seen that he's good, the transition that has to happen is a deepening assurance that all that God does is good, and that he might not be quite as concerned about the here and now as you are, and that he is painting an eternal picture. And that if you are willing to take what you have now and lay it on the altar before God's throne and let him burn that up, he will give you something better. Real life. He who loses his life because of me will find it. This is the family that we're called to be a part of. So then in John 15, I have to stop a second because John 15, when I went to studying it some more this time around, I referenced it quite a bit in the last message that I preached because 1 John, presumably authored both by the Apostle John, is heavily looking back to John 15. I mean, you cannot read them both without seeing the parallels. 1 John is the Apostle John expounding on the things that are recorded in John 15. Once again, as I studied this time, I saw something that I've never seen before. I had a great struggle in not reading straight through about 5 chapters of John. We don't have enough time this morning. But before I can, in good conscience, read 3 verses out of John 15 to you, I have to let you understand, if you go back and study, which I seriously implore you to do, the context of this is they've eaten the Passover meal. The Last Supper. Mere hours before Jesus Christ is crucified. And then it says that Judas goes out. After Judas goes out, it says Jesus began to speak to his disciples, okay? So now all of the phonies, all the fakes, all the hypocrites are weeded out, and the only men that are left, not the crowds, not Judas, is simply 11 faithful followers of Jesus Christ. That's it. And he commences to speaking, and he goes on for John 13, John 14, John 15, John 16, and John 17. 5 chapters. I know that it's chronological and continuous because halfway through it, it stops and says, and Jesus said, let us depart this place. And then the conversation carries on. And then the next thing it says, and when he had finished these things, they arrived at the Garden of Gethsemane. So you've got to think of this in context. Jesus Christ is about to be crucified. And the last thing, he knows he will never, ever speak to his disciples again that side of the grave. And these are the things that he felt were life and death important. They're about to have their faith tested like it's never been tested before. And he says, this is the things you must hear. So before I can read these, I have to ask you, please do your Christian walk a favor and go read all of the message that Jesus Christ left, because he also said, and I don't only say these to you, but for those who come after you who will believe by your testimony. Go read the sermon that Jesus preached 2,000 years ago. But an excerpt from that, John 15, 18 through 21, is this. If the world hates you, I have to stop a second because I went and looked at the Greek here. The word world here, I was kind of surprised. I hadn't expected this. It's the word cosmos. I had to do a bunch of studying on cosmos because I thought I knew what that word meant. And I thought, wait a minute, galaxies, everything? And it didn't make any sense until I remembered the scripture where it says that God subjected all things to futility at the fall of man. You understand, it says all of creation groans waiting for your restoration as sons. And Jesus himself talked about the ruler of this world coming. And I mean, as much as it might not feel like it sometimes. For instance, I went and hung out with this group of guys at the beginning of this week. We had some great talks. I felt a little bit like an outsider a lot when the cell phone with the not so great pictures was like, hey, can you look at this? And I'm like, well, it's not a matter of can, it's a matter of should. And, well, here, pass this over to the next guy then. We had those kind of conversations, but it didn't feel so much like the world hated me. But when I look at it in this context and realize that what it was talking about is that if you are serving God, you will be contrary to all of the decay and the rot in the entire solar system. You get that? If the world hates you, understand that it hated me before it hated you. He's saying, this isn't anything new. You shouldn't be whining and complaining when you face some opposition if you choose to truly follow me. Because they're just doing the same thing to you they did to me. The world would love you as its own. If you were of the world would love you as its own. However, because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of it, the world hates you. Remember the word I spoke to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But they will do all these things to you on account of my name, because they don't know the one who sent me. Last time I spoke, the question that I preached from in my own mind was, do I love God? I didn't stand up here to poke a finger in your face and ask you, do you love God? I stood up here and I preached to me. And God preached to me and said, do you love me, Andrew? Do you love me? And when I read this, it spoke to me in a little different way than it ever has, because I thought, if I am truly, truly loving God, serving God, and following Jesus Christ, and if the world doesn't really seem like it's hating me too much, and it seems more like it's loving on me, then does that say something about how salty I am at the moment? How much I taste like Jesus Christ? I've read the Gospels exhaustively, and you know I can only find 2 responses to the gospel message as Jesus preached it. Only 2. I cannot find apathy. I find repentance and I find anger. That's it. When people encountered Jesus Christ, they didn't say, I hung out with him 2 years and God wasn't there and I called off the search. When people hung out with Jesus, either they fell on their knees and said, what must I do to be saved? Or they said, I hate this man because he's shining a light in the spots I don't want light. So, A.W. Tozer, I've read a lot of him lately, by the way. You guys are going to get Tozered. It's kind of the spiritual equivalent of a police taser. We've got a Christian Tozer. A.W. Tozer. We evangelicals also know how to avoid the plain instructions and sharp point of obedience of our Lord in the New Testament. By means of fine and intricate explanations, these are tailor-made for the flesh. They excuse disobedience, worldliness, and carnality, and make the words of Christ of no effect. And the essence of it all is that Christ simply could not have meant what he said. His teachings are accepted even theoretically only after they have been weakened by interpretation. That hurts. You know why it hurts? It's because it's true. Are we ready to simply take what Christ said, compare it to our lives, and say, do I look like this? And if I don't look like this, why not? So this message today at its core is really a message about allegiances. Where does your allegiance lie? Now, I'm not talking about allegiance to a whole group of people here, but I'm talking about radical allegiance to God. We got to go back here to Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11 to see just how serious God takes this stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that I want to kick this into practice, but I'm going to tell you, we've got to remember that the same God that wrote this sent us Jesus Christ. I think he's a little bit more serious about our dedication and loyalty to him than we frequently are. Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, any of the gods of the peoples around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other. Get that? He's saying if they try to talk you into anything on earth that is contrary to loving and serving me, You must not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity and do not spare him or shield him. Instead, you must kill him. Your hand is to be the first against him to put him to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone him to death for trying to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. All Israel will hear and be afraid, and they will no longer do anything evil like this among you. This is radical. He's not talking about going out and doing massacres all over the world outside of the land of Israel. What he's talking about is if in your family, in your list of acquaintances, in the group of people who claim to be servants of mine, if someone near and close to you begins to shift away and say, I want to go serve something else and I want you to come with me, says when your conscience pricks you, you are to step back and say, no! Are we living like obedience and allegiance to God is that serious to us? Serious enough that had we lived in the era where God did require this, we would have done it. We don't live in that era now, but there was a time if God had dropped you in to that day and age, along with all of the people in this room, how many of us would still be standing? God's pretty serious about holiness. And even Jesus himself had to walk this stuff. You know, we don't think about much, or often think about the fact that Jesus was the Son of God, but he was also called the Son of Man. And it's because he was very, very human. And you know what? He loved his family. The last thing he did when he hung on the cross was said, Mother, here's your son. Son, here's your... He took one of his closest disciples and said, man, I'm about to leave, and I love my mom. Will you take care of her for me? Can any of you relate to that? You're dying, you know you're going to die, a building collapsed on you, whatever, and your best buddy shows up and your mom's there, and you're like, hey, I'm not worried about me. Take care of my mom for me. That's the guy we're talking about here. When it says in Mark 3, 20 through 21, and then 31 through 35, then he, Jesus, went home. He goes back to his own hometown. And the crowd gathered again so that they were not even able to eat. When his family heard this, they set out to restrain him because they said, he's out of his mind. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, it was packed, they couldn't get in. They sent word to him and called him, literally mouth to mouth. Pass the word in. We need him to come out here. We can't get into him. A crowd was sitting around him and told him, look, your mother, your brothers, and your sisters are outside asking for you. He replied to them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who were sitting in a circle around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So, who is our family? Who is your mother, your sister, your brother? First off, are you doing the will of God? Because if not, there may be people who are going to have to say, I'm sorry, I can't go with you where you're walking. People in this room might have to say, you know, I see you're in a holding pattern. I see that you've accepted Jesus Christ, but I also see that God has called me to radically abandon all and follow him, and I've got to run that direction, and you're walking that direction. Or maybe going back, sorry, I can't go with you. If you're in that spot, it's time to get on your knees and pony up. Say, God, here I am. But you also might be the guy that's got to run on. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. I left off here last time I preached in 1 Corinthians, where it talked about all the wicked things, religion. But now here is what it says the family of God looks like. Loving God and loving your brothers. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy, is not boastful, is not conceited, does not act improperly, is not selfish, is not provoked, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Even in this list of all the things that love is, Paul presumably sees fit to add the one does not in there. Finds no joy in unrighteousness. He's referencing back again to that concept that says anyone who does not hate father, mother, brother, sister, this whole list, and love me more. No, you're not going to go down and laugh with the guys about their wickedness. That's what I fought this week. These guys are stinking funny. They can make wickedness sound really fun. Even if I'm sitting there thinking, I don't think I want to join in that, I can certainly go, wow. Anybody ever heard of a vicarious thrill where you're just kind of like, wow, that's got to be kind of flirting with the edges out there, and these guys look pretty cool and they look like they're having fun. But are we serving and following God? A.W. Tozer again. This is the only other Tozer quote in here. This one was probably, I read through Born After Midnight, like I understand many of you are. This quote out of that book just stopped me dead in my tracks. If this is all I got out of the book, it was life changer. A.W. Tozer. Has it ever occurred to you that 100 pianos all tuned to the same fork are automatically tuned to each other? They are of one accord by being tuned not to each other, but to another standard to which each one must individually bow. So 100 worshipers met together, each one looking away to Christ, are in heart nearer to each other than they could possibly be were they to become unity conscious and turn their eyes away from God to strive for closer fellowship. 100 religious persons knit into a unity by careful organization do not constitute a church any more than 11 dead men make a football team. I had to add this in here because whenever we talk about family, I grew up in a very, very small denomination, and it was a small church within a small denomination, and I was related to 2/3 of the people there by blood. I know what happens in the hearts and minds of men and women when passages about family and the church start getting read in small, close-knit environments. As we look at the four walls around us and we go, boy, we're glad we're in here. If we could just get the rest of the world on our wavelength, we'd have it made. The message that I'm preaching you today may someday call you to walk a different direction than the person sitting next to you. Do you know that if the words of Christ are to be taken literally, there's a good chance that there are some people in this room that you will not walk into heaven with? I'm not looking around here judging who's in and who's out because I'm commanded not to. But I'm realistically looking at what Jesus said when he said, small is the door and narrow is the way and few are they that find it. And even Paul said to judge or analyze yourselves to see if you be in the faith. These kind of messages should not bring condemnation. If they do, the enemy is pounding you, and we will be happy to get together and pray with you and help you work through that. But they should bring about sober introspection. We were created with a need to belong, to be a part of something. Ever since the fall of man, we have been trying to find out where we fit and fill the hole that everyone subconsciously senses inside. You need a family. If you don't make God your family and all of those that love God, you will fill that hole with wicked friends, wicked practices, and everything else that God hates. Because meeting Jesus only elicits one of two responses: repentance and embracing Him, or pushing Him away. And we can do that even from inside the pews of a church. So who is your family? Thank you, and let's end with a prayer. Father, I just thank you for bringing us into here this morning. I ask your blessing on all of the people here. I ask that your word would do exactly what we've been told it would, where it divides even to joints and marrow and piercing down inside of us, Father. Every person here has work that is yet to be done. And I ask that you would commence that work with a passion today, Father. Please clean us out. And Father, please show us what it means to cling to you, to cleave unto you, and to depart from all others, Father. I just thank you, Father, for this day.